It's a pleasure for me to be chairing this event, and it's a pleasure to be introducing Zaid Al-Ali to you all. Firstly, I'd like to ask you all to put your phones on silent, or even better, switch them off. And just a few words about our speaker today. So Zaid Al-Ali is a senior advisor at IDEA, which deals with electoral laws and regulations, constitutional law and constitutional issues as well. He spent a lot of time in Iraq doing a lot of research throughout Iraq, it should be emphasized. And he's just come out with a new book, The Struggle for Iraq, published by Yale University Press, and it's available at a discounted price right at the end, so a bargain. And if you want to know more about CASS and its events in the future, you can visit shiaresearch.com for more on that. And I think we'll go straight to it. So,
okay, great. Okay. So good evening. Thanks again to the organizers. Thanks, of course, to my friend Haider, and thanks to Ranj for the introduction. So I'll be speaking tonight. What I'll be doing is I'll be giving more or less a summary of the main arguments that I make in the book. It's a summary. I'm only going to be speaking for around 30 or 40 minutes, so this is going to be brief. The detail is all in the book if you're interested, and we can also discuss later if you want. So I'm just going to give an outline to start out with about the issues that I'm going to be speaking about. The first is the issue of the state of the country that we're in, the services, the state of our country. The next is I'll be focusing on the drafting process of the Constitution, how it was conceived, and I'll also be talking about what's in the Constitution. And then I'll be talking about who is in charge of Iraq, and then finally what possible solutions may exist for our situation. The introductory points that I want to make, and I hope you'll bear with me in this, is first of all that I'll be focusing my comments mainly on the Prime Minister and his inner circle. Now, the reason why I'm going to be focusing on the Prime Minister and his inner circle isn't because I have anything personally against him. I don't have any problem with him personally. I'm sure he's a nice man, and I don't have a problem with the way he looks. I don't have a problem with his name or anything like that. The reason why I'll be focusing on him is because he's the Prime Minister, and he's therefore responsible for governing the country. That's the essential reason why. And I won't be discussing anyone else in detail. The reason why isn't because I think that the Prime Minister is better or worse, but because the Prime Minister is a person who's governing the country. It's the only reason why. If anyone else was governing, I would be focusing on that individual and not on anyone else, okay? The other introductory point that I want to make, and I hope also you'll bear with me on this as well, is that I'll be discussing, not in significant detail, but in some detail, some constitutional issues. And I'll be trying to convey the ideas in a way that won't be too boring for everyone. Constitutional law interests me, but it doesn't interest everyone. So I'll be trying to discuss those things in a way that isn't too boring. If there's anything that isn't clear, please feel free to interrupt, and I'll try to explain in greater detail. Okay, so the situation that we're living in today, I'll go through this very briefly because you know most about this, most of you know about this anyway. There's, at the moment, we're going through a period of increased violence in Iraq. Large swaths of the country are now outside of the government's control. And there's even news that some of the gruesome practices that we saw in 2005 and 2006 and 2007 are recurring now at almost a daily rate. You've probably heard of some of these in recent days. What are the causes for this increased level of violence? Now, there are two groups of causes. The first group is the first 3 points that are out on the screen right now, which is the long-standing Sunni insurgency, the insurgency that exists in Sunni Arab areas. The other, of course, which is a new factor, a relatively new factor, which is the conflict in Syria, which has made the border area with Syria even more lawless than it used to be, with large amounts of smuggling, etc., and of course, foreign support for the violence. That's also a very clear factor that's been going on for a long time. A second group of factors, however, all these factors are somewhat outside of the government's control. The government cannot control the conflict in Syria. The government has very little that it can do about the amount of foreign support that goes to fuel the insurgency. However, there are some factors that are in the government's control, and that's the second group of factors. Those include human rights abuses, corruption, and the lack of legitimacy. So I'll be talking about mostly those. The reason why I'll be focusing on those, once again, is because I'm focusing on government performance. So you know about issues like the Sunni insurgency and so on and so forth. I take it for granted that we don't need to discuss those because we've been talking about those for years. What I'm focusing on is government performance and government legitimacy, okay? So, human rights abuses, I won't be talking about this in detail because once again, you've heard about this before, and also I don't want to go into too much gruesome detail about the types of practices that are ongoing in detention. But you've heard about these things already. Large groups of people are arrested for practically no good reason in Iraq, for no reason. They're grouped up, taken away into detention, often for days, if not weeks, sometimes months, sometimes even longer. The Constitution provides, as all modern constitutions do, that all detainees in Iraq are supposed to be given access to a lawyer within 24 hours. They're supposed to be accused of a crime within 24 hours. They're supposed to be brought before a judge and accused officially. Obviously, that does not happen in large amounts of cases. Okay? In large amounts of cases, people are detained for weeks and never know why. They're beaten and never know why. They're told that they have to confess to crimes that they don't have much knowledge about, etc., etc. And incidentally, this happens to people of all races and religions. It's not something that's done exclusively to any particular group. Okay? And the treatment is the same. Okay? So this is just one example of a report that was published some time ago. The title's there for you to see. I don't need to go into detail about what it says. Another practice is secret jails. Okay? That, unfortunately, is a practice that continues, and it's very, very unfortunate. The detainees are taken to these places and kept there for long periods of time. Families have no idea where they're kept, etc., etc. It's very, very unfortunate. The documentation is also done by, so the two reports before were by foreign organizations. However, there's also the Iraqi Ministry of Human Rights, which also documents these practices as well. They have a yearly report on the status of prisons and detention centers, and they detail the same gruesome practices. Most recently, also the United Nations has put out many reports. The types of practices that they set out in the report, this is just in summary: arbitrary arrest and detention, no access to lawyers or family members, detention because of political, ethnic, or sectarian affiliations, threats, abuse, and mistreatment to force confessions. Okay, so that's in relation to human rights abuses, which obviously does not help when you're trying to calm a population and try to force them or trying to encourage them to follow the rule of law. However, there's another practice which has been very negative and which has been going on for years and years and years in Iraq now, which also contributes to security problems, and that includes corruption. Okay? So this is a leaked memo. It was leaked from the United States Embassy in 2007. So this is now 7 years ago. And even in 2007, this was old news. So these practices have been going on for a long time. So this leaked report, what does it say? It says, this is just a summary, some extracts: Iraq is not capable of even rudimentary enforcement of anti-corruption laws. Politicization and fear of accountability are serious impediments to enforcement of anti-corruption laws. The government of Iraq is making grudging progress, emphasize the word grudging, in capability to investigate and prosecute corruption, and not at a level that would support any reasonable timeline. What that last part means is that at the current pace, they won't make any real progress. Okay? So that, once again, is in 2007. If you look at Transparency International's Anti-Corruption Index from 2010, you'll see that Iraq ranked 175, that's third from bottom. Okay? The only countries that were found to be more corrupt than Iraq at the time was Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Somalia. And then, this is the more recent, this is last year's ranking. So now Iraq is doing this a little bit better. It's less corrupt now than Libya, South Sudan, and Sudan. South Sudan, incidentally, is a new country, so it wasn't in the ranking before. So now it's mainly just Libya and Sudan. The other thing I would like to emphasize is that looking at this list, if you look at countries like Sudan, Afghanistan, North Korea, Somalia, the combined budget of these countries is really minuscule in comparison to Iraq's budget. Really, really minuscule. Okay? Iraq's Ministry of Defense has a larger budget than all of those countries put together. Just the Ministry of Defense. Okay? So when you're talking about corruption in a country like Somalia, the amount of money that's being stolen is really pittance compared to Iraq. Okay? Now, but what's really important about this is that it's, as I mentioned before, you have the reports from 2006 and 2007. Then you have the continued corruption. Now, the government has had 7 to 8 years to react to this. Basically, 2 full terms of Maliki's government. Now, having followed legal reform processes closely in detail for the past 8 years, my open question to you is, how many anti-corruption laws were passed over these past 8 years? How much reform was passed, in your view? Can you hazard a guess? I'll answer for you: almost nothing. Almost nothing. And the only reason why the one law that was passed was not because the intention wasn't to improve the anti-corruption framework. It was just a matter of controlling specific institutions. So the government encouraged the passing of specific laws just to change who would be in control of a specific institution, but not to improve the anti-corruption framework. And in my view, that's highly problematic when you have a situation in Iraq where you have high levels of poverty, where you have children that go to sleep hungry, where you have people that live in open garbage sewage and or areas where there's open sewage. I find it highly problematic that billions of dollars a year are stolen and no effort is made in order to stop that hemorrhaging of money. Okay? Moving on, so on this issue of corruption, what is the relationship between corruption and security? The magic wands, which you've probably heard of. Okay? The official title of this device is something like the ADE 541 or something like that. I'm sure you've all heard that the owner of this device, Jim McCormick, the owner of the company that sold these devices to Iraq, is now in jail. He sold many thousands of these devices to the Iraqi government and is now in jail in the United Kingdom for fraud. The court issued its decision in May 2013, and the judge issued the following remarks in relation to the owner of the company. He said, "The device was useless, the profit outrageous, and your culpability as a fraudster has to be placed in the highest category. Hotel security staff and many other users trusted their lives to the overpriced devices sold by you, which are no more than crude plastic components with a disconnected antenna and a capability of detecting explosives no better than random chance." Now, anyone that has spent any time in Iraq knows how often you encounter these things, right? They're all over the place. There are checkpoints throughout the capital. There are checkpoints on highways and so on and so forth. Between Baghdad and Najaf, I think there's something like 60 checkpoints. Between Baghdad and Tikrit, there's also something like 60 checkpoints. And at many of these checkpoints and checkpoints within the capital, they use this device as the sole means to detect whether or not there are explosives in the cars. And as you can see, the British court was not too impressed with its ability to do so. Okay? Now, my problem with this is that many institutions and many bodies and many experts looked into these devices in order to determine whether or not they functioned, and they all found unanimously that they do not. And anyone you ask in Iraq, ordinary Iraqis, security officials, whatever, will also tell you the same thing. They'll also tell you that they're clearly useless. Okay? And yet, in May 2013, when the Prime Minister was asked about these devices in a press conference, I can't show you the video, I'm afraid, because there's a problem with sound. But in this press conference, what the Prime Minister said at the time was, in fact, they do work. Okay? The reason why he said security officials were sent to jail the owner of the company was sent to jail in the United Kingdom wasn't because the device does not work. He said the problem is that we were overcharged. Okay? The devices work, he said. If they don't work in specific instances, it's not because the devices are faulty, it's because the officers were not trained in their use, he said. Okay? Now, once again, that's highly, highly problematic in a situation in a country where you have dozens of explosions happening all the time. You have people being killed every day. Okay? You have security incidents every day. The main device that's being used to detect explosives is clearly faulty, and there's unanimous opinion about its uselessness. The Prime Minister of the country is defending its use. He's the only individual that I'm aware of that defends its use in such a clear way. And incidentally, to the right of the Prime Minister is Hussein Shahristani, who you probably all know has a PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Toronto. So it would be difficult for me to be convinced that he doesn't know that the devices don't work. Okay? It would be difficult for me to understand, to believe that. Anyway, so there's a clear link between government performance and security. Moving on to something a little bit more esoteric is services, right? So anyone that spent any time in Iraq knows that there are continuous problems with electricity. This is a graph that traces the evolution in the production of electricity in comparison to demand. As you can see, demand in 2006, there was a gap between demand and provision and supply, and the gap is almost the same many, many years later. Okay? Even though there's an evolution in supply, the demand still far outstrips supply. And anyone that spent any time in Iraq during summer knows how upset people get in relation to this, particularly in the south of the country. This is a still image from a riot that took place in Basra just last year. They happen every year in summer throughout the south, particularly in the south, because of the very, very high temperatures and the very difficult quality of life that they have to live through. And the explanation that's always given by government forces when these riots take place is, quote, these individuals are ruffians, they're barbarians, they're told. Okay? Okay, something else that I talk a lot about, but not everyone is interested in, but I think it's much more important than any of these other things, and that's climate change. because security problems, corruption, these are temporal. They can get better one day, and hopefully they will. Soon, hopefully, those practices will disappear. However, climate change may be permanent. We don't really know. Okay? And this is highly, highly problematic. So this is a report from 2001, so before the war took place. It focused on the marshlands in the south of the country, okay? And on the impact of the fact that they were drained in 2001. This is just an extract from the report. I won't read the whole thing to you. I'll just read a small extract. It said, with salt crusts and dry marshland soil exposed, wind-blown dust laced with various impurities will considerably increase, affecting thousands of square kilometers well beyond Iraq's borders. Ecosystem degradation at such a grand scale may have serious drawbacks on human health, ranging from the effects of water scarcity and pollution to increased exposure to thermal extremes and potentially toxic dust storms, blowing off salt plans and dried marsh beds. Okay? Now, just to, I'll translate that into more ordinary language. What they're essentially telling us in 2001, 2 years before the war, is that you should expect, Iraqis should expect, very serious dust storms in the future. Now, I don't know if all of you know the distinction between a dust storm and a sandstorm. Sandstorms occur naturally. Their winds blow in the desert and carry with them sand. Dust storms occur when dried and dead biological material are carried by the sand. So what was otherwise rich land with water, agricultural, so on and so forth, when that dies and dries, the wind takes with it dust, not sand. And that occurs and can occur at any point in the year. And what the report is telling us is, as a result of the drying of the marshlands, in 2001, they're telling us that you should expect serious dust storms. Now, this is a report that was done in, 2008. This is the first scientific study that was done on the water levels in Iraq, using satellite images. And what it said at the time, this is the title of the report, first super high resolution model projection that the ancient Fertile Crescent will disappear in this century, meaning there will not be enough water to subsist, to support life in our country. Okay, desertification has been noted over the past few years in all of these areas, from top to bottom, all the way from Mosul, all the way down to Basra. And desertification forces villagers and farmers to leave their land and to move to try to find land that's still fertile. We now have in Iraq not just security refugees, we have internally displaced people who are leaving their land because their land has turned into desert. Okay? Upstream dams and reduced rainfall are also a contributing factor to this as well. As you know, our two great rivers are fed in from rainfall from Turkey and partially from Iran as well. And Iran and Turkey are constructing upstream dams, meaning dams before they get to Iraq. You can see here, this is a satellite image from Turkey of 3 dams that were constructed. You see these 3 lakes that appear there that are not natural. These are dams that were constructed that appeared as a result of dams being built in Turkey. And Turkey, I'll skip this 1 second, has a plan called the GAP, right, which is the Greater Anatolia Project. This has been on the books now for decades and is now increasing in pace. What they plan to do in Greater Anatolia, meaning in the border area with Iraq, is what they plan to do is build 30 dams in the border area. 30 dams. Okay? Now, what is the impact? This is a photo that I took in Iraq during the dust storm. Okay, this is what they look like from the inside. Now, some of you may have seen some modern Hollywood movies where they put filters in the camera that change the color of the screen. There's no filter here. This is what it really looks like during a dust storm. Okay? This is some school children playing football, just a few meters away ahead of me. Some of my relatives. This is me and my wife. Now look at this photo. This is just to give you an image of an idea of how drastic this is. So you can see this is just some leaves. You can see the color. What I did is I took this photo, then I just shook the leaf for just a second, and I took another photo. So this you can see the contrast in color. Okay? You can see if you just shake it, it turns green. So it's green underneath. It's not the camera that it's fault. It's the sand. It's the dust that's covering the leaves. Once again, the shook just a little bit, and it turns green. Okay? You can see this poor fellow shaking this tree to shake the dust off of his produce. It goes into the water and affects life and water as well. You can see the atmosphere. This is my computer at the time. After just a couple of hours of dust, you can see I just swiped my finger on the top of the laptop so you can see how thick the dust is on the laptop. This is a photo of not far from where my father was born. So my father was born not far from Tikrit, okay? This is a photo I took in 2004, so you can see how clear the air is. I stood in the same place in 2010 during a dust storm, just so that you can see what it looks like. Okay, this is what it looks like just a few years later. This is a video of a dust storm from inside. Once again, there's no manipulation from the camera. This is actually what it looks like. Okay? So those of you who have been in Iraq and have seen this, those of you who haven't been might be a little bit surprised. And when these things take place, everything shuts down. Life shuts down. Schools close, universities close, businesses close, roads close, airports close, everything closes. Everyone stays at home, and you just wait for it to pass. And what's the impact? For example, okay, this is an extract from a press article from Al-Hayat newspaper, which is not an Iraqi newspaper. It says that in Najaf, during one particular dust storm, 13 people died of respiratory diseases. 13 people as a result of one dust storm. Okay? And this is an extract from another press article which says that Ban Ki-moon, so the Secretary General of the United Nations, is expecting, as a result of scientific studies that were done, that soon we shall have 300 dust storms per year in Iraq. 300 dust storms per year. Of course, not each dust storm covers the whole country, so you won't be exposed to 300 dust storms as an individual, but 300 dust storms for any country is a major problem, obviously. Okay. Now, collapse of the agricultural sector, increased unemployment, respiratory diseases, other health problems, depression. And my question is, having all these problems occurring, what has been the government's policy? What is the government's policy? What is the government doing in order to alleviate these problems? What is the government doing? There are some small measures. They've replanted some trees. Where millions of trees have been replanted, they've now planted, where millions of trees were uprooted and destroyed as a result of all of the wars, something like around 20,000 trees have been replanted. Okay, so there's still a huge amount of work to be done. And also, considering that a country like Turkey is in the process of building 30 dams, and Turkey is a country that's energy hungry. The reason why they're building these dams is because of energy. And Iraq is a country that has plenty of oil and gas. You would think that there should be a natural solution to this problem. We give you oil and gas, you don't build the dams. Has that deal been put on the table? Not yet. We're still waiting, years into it. We're still waiting for that deal to be put on the table. Okay? Now, we have human rights violations, we have corruption, we have services, we have desertification, right? What is the government response in relation to all of these things? When people accuse the government face on and tell the government you're incompetent, you have failed, what is the response from the government? The response is sadly this type of thing. Okay? Now I can't show you this video once again because of problems with sound, but this is an extract from an interview between two individuals. One is Hiwa Uthman, who some of you may know, is a prominent Kurdish journalist in Iraq, and with Zaid Al-Ali, who is one of the closest people to the Prime Minister. Okay? Some of you may have seen this. In this, I'll just play it for you, but you won't be able to hear it. What happens in this exchange is that Hiwa Uthman says that the government has failed, and the government is incompetent, and principally he blamed the Prime Minister. He says it's always the Prime Minister's fault, because he's always at the center of each scandal and so on and so forth. And the response from Zaid Al-Ali is, yes, you're right, the government has failed. And the reason why is because of Kurdish ministers. It's all their fault. And he used the words, and I quote, they're thugs, he said. He said, they're ruffians, he said. And he uses the word treason. He said, treason after treason. It's all their fault, he said. Okay? That's one example. Another example is this exchange from the same interview. Now, I don't know if any of you know Anas Tikriti. I don't know him personally. And to be quite frank, I find him a little bit too provocative for my taste. I don't really like his style. Okay? In this exchange, what he does is that he provocatively, I think it's unnecessarily provocative, compared the Prime Minister unfavorably to Saddam Hussein. Says it's so bad that it's worse than Saddam Hussein. And what was the reaction from Zaid Al-Ali? So Anas Tikriti, some of you may know, is the son of a prominent figure in the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay? And as you know, the Muslim Brotherhood had serious problems under the Ba'ath Party, and many of them were forced into exile. I think Anas Tikriti, I'm not sure, but I think he was actually born in exile. I'm not sure, but I think so. Okay? In any event, he's been living, if not his entire life, most of his life in exile, as a result of his father's affiliation to the Muslim Brotherhood. So here he accuses the Prime Minister of being worse than Saddam Hussein, and Zaid Al-Ali answers once again by saying, of course you would defend Saddam Hussein because you're a Ba'athist, he says to him. And then Anas al-Hikiti, you can see here, he gets very, very agitated. And he said, okay, you're not a Ba'athist, but you're part of the institution that supported the Ba'ath Party. What does that mean? It doesn't take a lot of decoding. What he's saying is, you're not entitled to criticize us, you're Sunni. Okay? It's very, very clear. And there are other examples, of course. Okay, here's another example of this. Okay, so some of you may know this individual. He's a prominent, somewhat prominent sheikh. Sheikhs go up and down in Iraq. At one point he was prominent. I'm not sure if he still is today, but in 2013 he certainly was. Okay. Now, what was happening in 2013 is that many people in the south of the country were very upset at government performance. They were very upset at corruption, very upset at services, and so on and so forth. And many people were spreading the idea that they should not vote in the elections. They were saying, don't vote. Whatever you do, do not vote, because in any event, whatever happens, the government will be the same. Our lives will not improve. Don't vote. Shahasanna, we haven't obtained anything. Do not vote. And the response comes from this individual. What he says here, and once again, I apologize because I can't show you the sound. What he says here is, don't tell me that we shouldn't vote. Don't tell me, because we are involved in a war, he says. This is a war between us and them. He says, I'm live on television, so I can't tell you who us and them is, but you know what I mean, he says. Okay? And then he says, now of course, if you ask me about the government's performance, I'll tell you it's terrible. I'll tell you honestly it's terrible. We're all upset with the government, but what can we do? We have no choice. We have to support them. Even if they lie to us and even if they steal from us, we have to support them, because at least they're defending us, he says. And he says, and then, even worse, he says, even if it's a lie, and even if they don't really mean it, at least they say so. Okay? I don't know if you realize how dramatic it is, or if I'm properly conveying how dramatic this is. What he's saying is, at least they are lying to us about them defending us. And then at the end of this short extract, what he says is, what can we do? All we can hope is for one of these politicians to get sick of stealing and for him to send us something that's left over from the state's budget. Okay? That's the response. The response isn't to improve performance. The response isn't to hold government accountable. The response isn't to fire ministers and to fire officials. The response is, you're a Sunni, what do you know? You're a Kurd, what do you know? If you're a Shia and you're complaining, then you're either a fool or a ruffian. Okay? Now, how did this come to pass? This is something that I explore in detail in my book. Okay, but in the book it's reverse order. My publisher forced me to start chronologically, so I had to start from 2003 and move on forwards. So in chapter 3 of the book, I focus on how the Constitution was drafted and what it says. Okay? Now you may know that at the time, the Constitution was drafted in a negotiated process. The Americans first arrived in 2003, and what they were intending on doing was appointing a group of people that would draft the Constitution. Many people in Iraq rejected that, principally Ayatollah Ali Sistani. Okay? He said, absolutely not, that would be outrageous, and we reject the suggestion altogether. What we insist on doing is we insist on elections, he said. The Americans resisted. I won't go through the details of what happened, but in any event, at the end, they relented. They felt that they could not overcome Ayatollah Sistani's authority, and they felt that at the end they had to accept that elections should take place. So the elections took place in January 2005, and the drafting committee was supposed to draft it within 6 months, and referendum in October 2005. Now, before the elections actually took place, what was done is an interim constitution was drafted. The interim constitution was referred to as the Transitional Administrative Law, the TAL. Okay? Now, what did the TAL say? The TAL split the country into 3 levels of government at a vertical level. So you have the central government, which is Baghdad. Then you have the regional governments, of which there was only one, which is the Kurdistan region, right? And then the provinces. So that at the vertical level as such. The TAL said that the central government in Baghdad should only have 7 powers, 7 only. And those included formulating foreign policy, formulating and executing national security policy, and formulating fiscal policy. And then finally what the TAL said is that all the powers that are not explicitly granted to Baghdad go to the regions and the provinces. Everything else goes to the regions and the provinces. So I'm going to disengage in a little bit of constitutional interpretation here. So anyone that's familiar with constitutional interpretation knows immediately you have to look at the specific words that are used. You have, in the first example, formulating foreign policy, and in the second, formulating and executing national security policy. What that means is that if you say that everything that is not specifically given to Baghdad goes to the regions and the provinces, what it means is that the central government can formulate foreign policy, but it cannot execute foreign policy. And the central government can formulate fiscal policy, but it cannot execute it, because it does not specifically say so. So this central system of government was outrageously decentralized, outrageously federal. There's no other example around the world of a system of government where the central government does not have the authority to execute foreign policy or does not have the authority to execute fiscal policy. There's no other example in the world. Okay. Now, who wrote the Tal? It's a legitimate question, right? The Tal was written, and there's an account of how it was written in a book by Larry Diamond, and the book is called Squandered Victory. He has an extract of his book. It's around 40 pages, in which he describes in detail how this document was drafted. Okay? It was drafted by a group of American officials, including him, including Larry Diamond, who's a professor at Stanford University, and 2 Iraqi Americans. Their names are Saddam Chalabi and Faisal Istrabadi. Okay, that group of people wrote the Tal, except for the provisions on federalism. Once again, Larry Diamond in his book, and also Paul Bremer in his book, which is called My Year in Iraq, they explain in detail how the sections on federalism were drafted. They were drafted as a result of negotiations between Paul Bremer and the leaders of the 2 Kurdish parties, Jalal Talabani and Masoud Barzani. Okay, so he took it upon himself to negotiate the details of the federal system of Iraq with those 2 parties. And then when the deal was finalized between Paul Bremer and the 2 Kurdish parties, and Masoud Barzani and Jalal Talabani, it was presented to the rest of the Iraqis as a done deal, and no amendments were made. Okay? Now, the agreement, once again, at the time, was that elections should take place to draft the final constitution. This was merely the interim constitution, This was merely the interim constitution that was drafted in order to govern the interim period until we had a permanent constitution. And once again, one of the items that was included in the deal between the CPA, between the Americans, and Ayatollah Ali Sistani was that the interim constitution that should be drafted should in no way influence the final constitution. Right? The final constitution should only be the result of the work of the elected representatives of the people. That was the deal at the time. Now, what is the official version of how the constitution was drafted? The official version was elections took place. The elections led to the election of a 275-member parliament. The parliament decided that they wouldn't draft the constitution completely on its own. What they decided to do is that they elected 60 members of the 275 to be drafters, that these individuals would draft the constitution. Okay? And the 60 individuals wrote the constitution according to the official narrative. There were some problems towards the end. Negotiations took place. They went past the deadline of August, but in any event, they completed the text. It was put to referendum, and eventually 80% of the population voted in favor of the constitution. That's the official narrative as it's accepted by most analysts. Now, the real version of events, I describe in chapter 3 of my book, is something that's been written about a little bit in academic literature, but has not made it into the mainstream press at all. Okay? Now, the real version of events is sadly much more complicated. What happened is that at the beginning of August 2005, so just to remind you, the constitutional drafting process started officially in January. It started in January 2005, and it was supposed to end, there was a deadline of 15th of August 2005. Okay? And they had the option, the drafters had the option, of extending by an additional 6 months if they thought it was necessary. So by the beginning of August, 2 weeks before the deadline, they had to decide very quickly whether or not they would extend the process by 6 months. The American embassy intervened and said, no, absolutely not, you shall not extend. Okay? So, well, how are we going to finish the text? We need more time to finish the text. The American embassy said, we're going to deal with this. They moved the discussions from the convention center where the negotiations were taking place to the American embassy, and also to the residence of Jalal Talabani. And then they started excluding people from the discussions. They said some people can come in, other people cannot. Okay? And then the American officials started working with Iraqi officials, the ones that they chose, in order to finalize the text. The group of people that were allowed to work on the text from beginning of August onwards were referred to loosely by people who were around at the time as the Leadership Council. We don't really know who was involved in those discussions because no official account exists. No official account. There were no records, no minutes, no photos, nothing. We have an idea of who was there based on some accounts, but we don't have a clear idea of who was there. We know for certain that representatives of the 2 Kurdish parties were there. representatives of the KDP and the PUK were there. We also know that representatives of the Supreme Council of the Islamic Revolution of Iraq was there, but we don't know really much more than that. We don't have a clear idea. We do know also that the American ambassador and the British ambassador were there, and they played an important role, much to the surprise of many people. And these people, once again, were selective, they were unaccountable, they were secretive, the discussions were not clear. Now, what did the Leadership Council do? Why did it intervene so dramatically, and what was the impact of what it did? Now, I mentioned before that the TAL, the interim constitution that was drafted by American officials, including Larry Diamond amongst others, included only 7 powers for the central government. 7 powers. What the Constitutional Drafting Committee did, the Constitutional Drafting Committee were the representatives of the people who were elected in January 2005, is that they took that list of 7 powers and expanded it to 21 powers. Okay? They significantly increased the amount of power that Baghdad had. Then what the Leadership Council did is that they took the draft that had been prepared by the elected representatives of the people, they put it in the dustbin, and then they resurrected the TAL. They said we shall go back to exactly what the TAL says, 7 powers and 7 powers only. Okay? Only 7 powers. Now, I'm just going to go over this just one last time because I think it's very important. Okay? This is Article 110 of the final Constitution. So some extracts from the final Constitution. The federal government shall have exclusive authorities in the following matters. Once again, formulating foreign policy, formulating and executing national security policy, and formulating fiscal policy. So remember the distinction that I drew before between the first and the third on the one hand, and the second extract. The first and the third only says formulating foreign policy and formulating fiscal policy, but not executing. Whereas national security policy is formulated and executed. And then other provisions from the Constitution. These are shared powers, managing customs, regulating the main sources of electricity, and formulating environmental policy. And then finally, Article 115, which says all powers not stipulated in the exclusive powers of the federal government. So in that list that I showed you earlier, belong to the authorities of the regions and provinces that are not organized. So therefore, according to our Constitution, the Constitution of 2005, it is up to the regions and provinces to execute foreign policy. Okay? It is up to the regions and provinces to execute fiscal policy. What that means is, I'll just skip ahead. What it means is the federal government has no control over airspace, has no taxation power, et cetera, has virtually no power, according to the Constitution. The regions get an annual budget transfer on a per capita basis and allows for all provinces to become regions. What that means is that if the country's heavily populated regions, including Basra, Baghdad, Mosul, become regions, then the central state not only has no power, but has no money anymore, has nothing to do. The conclusion is the central government has extremely little power and extremely little money and no power. Now, at the time, I was working for the United Nations in Iraq. I was a lowly individual. I had no influence whatsoever. But my boss at the time was Nelson Mandela's former legal advisor. He's a very pleasant individual called Nicholas Haysom. What he decided to do as the Constitution was being finalized is he asked some of the world's most prominent constitutional scholars to come to Baghdad and study the Constitution and give their opinion about what they thought of the Constitution. One of them, Professor Yash Ghai, who's perhaps the world's most recognized constitutional scholar, studied the Constitution and wrote in his opinion before the Constitution was finalized, so before the referendum date. He wrote that, quote, if this Constitution is applied, there will be grave danger to state and society. He wrote at the time, grave danger to state and society as a result of this Constitution. Okay? The impact. So we have a referendum in which 80% of the population votes in favor. So the way in which it was interpreted as a result of the results speak for themselves, is the vast majority of the Shia Iraqis, Shia Arab Iraqis, and the vast majority of Kurds vote in favor, whereas a crushing majority of individuals in Anbar and Salah ad-Din province vote against. And Anbar and Salah ad-Din, as you know, are 2 provinces that are principally populated by Sunni Arabs. Okay? So many interpreted this as reflecting a Shia and Kurdish agreement on the Constitution and a Sunni rejection. However, once again, I have a different view. Okay? First of all, no one actually read the Constitution. And the reason why I know no one actually read it is because my office was responsible for printing it and distributing it. That's what the United Nations was responsible for doing. And we know, based on what happened at the time, that the printing company that we hired in order to print it and circulate it didn't actually print the Constitution. Okay? And based on anecdotal evidence from relatives of mine and friends and so on and so forth, no one actually saw a draft of the Constitution at the time. What many people did see is they saw lots of copies in the garbage, but no one actually got a copy of the Constitution. And some of my relatives live in central Baghdad. I'm not talking about people who live in the countryside and so on and so forth, right? Something else is that if there ever was an agreement between the Sunni population, the Shia population and the Kurdish agreement in relation to the Constitution, it wasn't in relation to the content of the Constitution, it was in relation to the process. Now the reason why I say that is because immediately after the Constitution entered into force, many statements were made by very prominent Shia politicians in relation to the Constitution. Obviously, Zami Khalilzad is not a prominent Iraqi Shia politician. He was the United States ambassador at the time. This is the way he characterized the draft Constitution at the time. He said on 16th of August 2005, "I know that some of the Sunni participants on the outside have spoken out against federalism." That's what he said. People have a right, obviously, to be for or against what they want, but as far as the Constitution is concerned, there is a broad agreement. So note how he describes the people who are opposed to the Constitution. Sunnis on the outside. I don't know what that means, a Sunni on the outside. Is there a Sunni on the inside and there's a Sunni on the outside? I'm not sure. But in any event, what he's saying is that only those people who he describes as being Sunnis on the outside are opposed. Everyone else is in favor, he said. There's consensus. Okay, fine. That's what he thinks. At the time, a few days before, Abdulaziz Hakim, who, as you know, supported the formation of a very large region in the south of the country that brought together 8 provinces. What he said is to keep the political balance of the country, Iraq should be ruled under a federal system next to the central government. We think it is necessary to form one entire region in the south. That's what he said at the time. Okay? So this leads some credence to the position of Zami Khalilzad. However, Laith Kubba, who was the government spokesman, the spokesman for the government, what he said, what he said, don't worry, I know he's here. What he said at the time was, the idea of a Shia region is unacceptable to us. On the same day on which Abdulaziz Hakim said that he supports the formation of a mega region in the south of the country, Laith Kubba says, the idea is unacceptable to us. Why did his view not percolate into Zami Khalilzad's assessment of the state of Iraqi opinion? I've got no idea, but he didn't take it into account. Muqtada Sadr, shortly after the Constitution entered into force, "I reject this Constitution which calls for sectarianism, and there is nothing good in this Constitution at all." Nasser Rubai, leader of the centrist bloc in Parliament, "The present conditions are not conducive to establishing regions because we lack a strong central government that can overrule the regions." And of course, most importantly, Nouri al-Maliki, "I believe that if we succeed in restoring security, political and economic powers to the central government, the need for federalism will diminish. And if federalism has to be, it should be a political system, not a national, ethnic, or sectarian federalism." Okay? So you have a plethora of prominent Shia Arab politicians who come out very clearly against the system of government as provided for in the Constitution, and yet for some reason, it's not taken into account. They're completely neglected. The only opinion that matters is that of Abdulaziz Hakim. And that's it. That's all that matters. Okay, so what is the impact? The Constitution establishes a frightening system of government. Remember the assessment that I mentioned to you earlier, a grave danger to state and society, of government designed to split the country apart. The constitutional process is accepted by the majority, but the substance is also rejected by the majority, although a different majority, right? The impact as a result of the fact that individuals like Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki and many others reject the content of the Constitution, is that now we don't have a Constitution that's enforced because they refuse to apply it. They refuse to apply the provisions in the Constitution on federalism. They think that if it is applied, it will lead to the breakup of the country. So effectively, we have no rules left. No rules, because that's what a Constitution should do. A Constitution is supposed to establish the rules that govern the system of government, right? But these individuals who are now in power think that this Constitution is simply not applicable. We cannot apply it. So therefore, no rules are left. So what's left? What's left is the elites. Now, every system of government, I'm almost done. Almost every system of government, in order to be effective and in order to function, depends on the application of rules, right? So in any country in the world, you have a constitution and you have political elites who are responsible for applying the rules, right? So here, in this case, we have no rules. All we have left is politicians. The politicians make up the rules as we go along. So therefore, we're left completely at the mercy of our political elites. So who are these individuals? Who are they? Okay. Who is in charge? You have the United States, which was responsible for military issues, government formation, and over time, decreased involvement. Iraqis, mostly the former exiles, very little training. With time, it's been very obvious that they're incompetent, they're paranoid, prone to thinking about conspiracies, and willingness to engage in deep moral compromise. Okay? Those individuals who did have training, who were competent, that had integrity, were either pushed out, either left, or made to disappear. Some of you will know who I'm talking about. All of this is very, very bad for any system of government that depends on a functioning parliament, because parliaments depend on trust, they depend on hard work, and they depend on negotiations between political parties. So if you're not willing to work hard, if you're not willing to trust your other, then your parliamentary system cannot work. Okay, all of that, in my view, is what led to the breakdown. We have no rules to govern our country, and we have a bunch of people who are incompetent, who are corrupt, and who do not have strong moral fiber, who are governing the country. So what is to be done? What is to be done? What's left for us today? Shall we just wait for economics to play its part in Iraq and for it to wreak havoc? Shall we wait for the price of oil to decline and for the government to go broke? Or should we actually do something about it? Okay? Now, in my view, we should do something. I don't know what exactly, but I have a proposition. I hope that it could at least contribute to a partial solution to the problems that exist in our country. Now, in our country, in Iraq, civil society has played a minor role over the past few years, but it's played some role. Now, when I talk about civil society, I don't mean the NGOs that have become very fat and corrupt on international assistance money. What I'm talking about is prominent individuals who are academics, who are intellectuals, prominent religious figures. These are the people I'm talking about. People who have interesting opinions, intelligent opinions, and who have influence on state and society. Now, civil society has had some success over the past few years in influencing state and society, only in relation to certain discrete issues, because those are the only issues in which it really focused. One is the electoral law. So our electoral law in 2005 was heavily, heavily flawed. It improved significantly in 2010. Many people said that the reason why is because of the United Nations and experts and so on and so forth, but the real reason why it improved was because it was at the insistence of the Marja'iyya. That's the real reason. The only reason why MPs accepted to improve the electoral law at the end of 2009 was because the Marja'iyya insisted that it should be improved. That's the only reason why. If the Marja'iyya had not insisted, then all of the international assistance and so on and so forth would have led to nothing. Okay? And you probably have heard about the MPs' benefits and their salaries. As you know, they're exorbitant. The only reason why it's being even discussed at the moment, the only reason why it's on the agenda is because of civil society, because prominent individuals, religious scholars and others, intellectuals, academics, etc., economists are bringing it to the table. They're forcing it on the table. And now it's been in discussion for more than a year. There hasn't been much improvement yet, but it's being forced onto the agenda as a result of the involvement of civil society. So what's missing for us is a comprehensive plan. Civil society has played an important role in relation to discrete issues, but so far we haven't come up with a comprehensive plan to improve state and society, to improve oversight, to improve control over corruption, to improve government performance, okay, to improve our constitution. What we need to do is we need to spend the next few years to work together to come up with a comprehensive plan that would allow for all of these things to be improved, and in a way that would make everyone happy to the exclusion of no one. After the plan is developed, then we can hope to force it onto the agenda in the same way that these other issues were forced onto the agenda, despite the politicians and not because of them. Now, I'm realistic, and I don't think that obviously any such plan would have a huge impact on Iraq, but even if we do develop the plan, and even if we take the time to develop the plan, and even if only 5% of it is implemented, that would already represent a huge improvement over what it is that we have so far. We're not going to become Germany overnight, but perhaps we can improve our situation just a little bit, and maybe that's what we should focus on over the next few years. That's all I'm going to say for now. I've spoken for far too long, and I apologize. And I'll take any criticisms, any comments, and any questions that you're willing to offer. Thank you very much.